Oh, well, here is my nemla presentation, and so it went over pretty well at the conference in Buffalo last week. And as you can see here, the title of the presentation is Networked Composition and Public Pedagogy. And basically the presentation goes into 4 parts. It starts off with a basic kind of introduction into emerging technologies, then moves to a discussion of how those technologies speak to the college campus and specifically to the writing classroom. And then I move into, at the end, a discussion of these 2 terms, networked composition and public pedagogy, in a more, theoretical, philosophical way, I guess you could say. So when we're thinking about emerging technologies, we need to think obviously about mobile networks. And today, as I'm sure everyone watching this online and my blog knows, we have more than 3 billion mobile phone accounts, which is about 1 account for every 2 folks, although obviously they aren't distributed that way, and we can also expect something like 2 trillion text messages to be sent this year. Those little statistics are just thumbnails of this larger transition that we're all aware of, where we have an increased ability to access information and media and so on, and so you guys all know that. And but during my presentation, I definitely want to make sure that that got across. So one of the primary aspects of these mobile networks is their impact on what we call group forming networks. Clearly the internet, prior to mobile networks, facilitated this to a tremendous degree, but it's become increasingly more powerful with the ability to carry around our networks with us. And essentially networks prior to the rise of the internet were incredibly expensive to try and develop and maintain. This is something Shirky talks a lot about in Here Comes Everybody, so I'll point you there for more on that discussion. But for our purposes, one of the things we see with mobile networks is this ability to form very loose affiliations with people that we share only passing temporary kinds of interests, like, for example, how long is the line at the security checkpoint going into the airport, right? That kind of forming a group for that purpose and sharing information and maintaining that over time, even though the members change over time. That kind of information is and group forming is easy to do. Or another example I pointed out at the conference was the whole thing with protests during the torch run in San Francisco, and the ability to share information and move the protests as the course of the run changed in real time. And one clear element of group formation is the ability to share media, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or podcasting or whatever, Second Life. These are all places where we're able to share information, and it may be like with Facebook that you start with relatively intimate connections, that our students are using Facebook to maintain on-campus friendships as well as friends from home, from high school. But then those kinds of networks do manage to spin out into larger groups where we're able to share information and media again with people that share, just the passing interests with us, or if, as well as far greater interests, potentially. And so one of the things that kind of results from that are the creation of these smart mobs, right, the Howard Rheingold's term. And so the thing that I want to take from this into my presentation is the idea of how our connections to networks make us smarter and give us a new capacity for cognition. And of course the flip side of that, particularly at a conference like nemla, where you're in a room with a lot of humanists, literary studies faculty, the question is, often turns to what are the effects for humans, or the way that we understand humanness when we start to think about networks. And this kind of image where you see this kind of faceless, androgynous, iconic kind of human being, is kind of off-putting in a way. And so, how do we deal with that kind of reaction, and how should we respond to being networked, so to speak? In particular, what does it mean for institutional culture? And as I just briefly mentioned before with the Clay Shirky book, you look at an institution like American colleges that came into being for the most part during the 19th century, and are designed to handle the difficult and costly economics of forming and maintaining groups. Right? So part of it is separating yourself. And this is a picture of my campus in Cortland, which is literally on a hill above the town. So it's the college on the hill, and an old building like this one, which is even meant to communicate, right, a sort of classical sensibility. It's filled with offices and classrooms, and is designed to maintain a division of knowledge, right, into departments, and then from departments into specializations. So I sit in my office and manage the new media rhetoric area of the world or whatever, and we all have these sort of discrete places, and then we have a very elaborate system for maintaining the relationships between our various segments. In fact, my college right now is going through this big debate over how they're going to organize the faculty senate. So that's this kind of institutional culture business is something that has been very costly, continues to be very costly, even though now we see other means for networking and forming groups. So we can certainly see that institutional culture at work in the writing classroom, right? The classical image of the writing classroom is the small teacher-student ratio. What does the NCT recommend? 15 to 1 or some sort of quixotic number like that. But certainly if it's 20 or even 25 to 1, the writing classroom instructor often points to the fact that the writing classroom is the place where first-year students actually get to know each other, and that the professor knows their names and so forth. Is different from the other huge lecture halls that they might be in. And the classroom pedagogy, writing pedagogy, is often hinged on the creation of trusting, intimate kinds of relationships between the students, and certainly between the student and the professor. However, of course, one of the continual fallbacks of that is the problem of trying to figure out who we are writing for and who we are writing to, right? That, as we insulate ourselves as writers, we have audience problems, and that's obvious in any kind of real-world situation. And, it's a problem that comes up continually in the writing classroom. We're always kind of inventing faux rhetorical situations in which to write. Of course, the intimate writing classroom is ultimately hinged on that notion of the private authorial mind that we're all familiar with, and right, that the idea that composition ultimately occurs inside of the head, and as a result, we fear the network, we doubt the network, we're skeptical of it. We think the network is the place where students are going to plagiarize, the place where students are getting faulty information from the Wikipedias of the world or whatever. Right? And so they're not relying on their own mind to compose texts, and so that's seen as a problem. So the network is kind of this threat to the idea of authorship as an internal process, and so it threatens the intimacy of the writing classroom, and it threatens the private authorial mind. And finally, it threatens this sort of base idea of what I call the sequestered semester. That is the linchpin of undergraduate education, where again, you come up onto the college on the hill, and you stay there for 4 years, and you're largely separated from the quote-unquote real world, right? And then when you're done here, you go off back into the real world, and you go on with your life, and you maybe never have to come back or whatever. And of course, there was always this idea that there was some level of communication or commerce between the marketplace and the college, but that relationship was very heavily monitored and managed by the institution. And so now that's not the case anymore. So when we think about the networked classroom, I like to think about a room like this. And now you might look at this image and say, well, there's no computers here. I don't see students with laptops. I don't see, you know, a data projector. I don't see anything that would suggest networking. But obviously, you know, that's exactly the point, because the network is invisible, generally speaking. It's, you know, this flowing of information in and out of the classroom. I mean, we've all seen, I would imagine, you know, the YouTube videos of professors flipping out. Right, and so we know that a student could be sitting in your classroom with a cell phone or similar technology, you know, record you doing whatever, record other students, and then upload that video or media to the web before you even get back to your office. So material can flow out of your office, out of your classroom, you know, like that. It can certainly flow into your classroom, whether it's, you know, the personal text message from friends, or, you know, connecting to the internet to do some kind of, you know, legitimate research, or, you know, trying to answer a question or find some supplemental material or anything along those lines. So the point, however, is that in the past, when you were sitting in this room, as the professor, you were largely in control of information coming in and out of the classroom. You were the arbiter, you were the authority. Now that's no longer the case. Right? All those, the intimate writing classroom just doesn't really exist as it once did. You know, that private authorial mind, although obviously the mind plays a part in composition, you know, just doesn't exist in the way that it once did. And so now we're kind of faced with a question of, well, how do we understand this space, and what do we do with it? So here I have Bruno Latour, and you maybe can't see this quote on the small screen on my blog, so I'll read it to you. This is from his most recent book. And Latour writes, "The lecture hall has been made to be a place by some other locus through the now silent mediation of drawings, specifications, wood, concrete, steel, varnish, and paint, through the work of many workers and artisans who have now deserted the scene because they let objects carry their action in absentia, through the agency of alumni whose generous deeds might be rewarded by some bronze plaque." And so what we ought to be able to make from Latour's point here is that the lecture hall has always been networked. The lecture hall has always been mediated. It's just that now we're looking at mediation and networking by other means than we had in the past. Right? And so just as those old technologies and materialities and policies worked to reinforce a certain set of relations that worked in certain ways and certain kind of epistemology, the new network offers us a different set of epistemologies and different sets of relations, which doesn't mean that necessarily that our purposes are deterministically changed in some way, that because we have this network now, colleges must, you know, have different kinds of goals and they must be XYZ, right? It means that things will change. I don't know that, not necessarily in a deterministic kind of way, however. We just have to look at what that material transformation is that we're going through. And this is also a point. This is a point that is reinforced by Henry Jenkins, who here says, "Injecting digital technologies into the classroom necessarily affects our relationship with every other communications technology, changing how we feel about what can or should be done with pencils and paper, chalk and blackboard, books, films, and recordings. Rather than dealing with each technology in isolation, we would do better to take an ecological approach, thinking about the interrelationship among all these different communication technologies, the cultural communities that grow up around them, and the activities they support." So, you know, last month I was doing a presentation on campus about the future of the book, and, you know, I was making what I think is a fairly obvious point, which is that there's no reason to imagine that the book is going to disappear in any, you know, short time frame, and, you know, like in the next decade or two or whatever. That the book industry is doing fine, that people buy books and read books and use books and so on and so forth. All these technologies are going to be around, right? I mean, I don't foresee chalkboards. I mean, maybe we have whiteboards instead of chalkboards, and maybe that makes a difference in somebody's mind. But I think, you know, we're going to have pencils and paper and books and films and recordings and whiteboards or blackboards, and all these technologies will be in the classroom, and also we'll have these wireless networks, and they will change and grow together. And so what we have to do is not see, think about one replacing the other or a constellation of the others and trying to do the same thing as the others did but better, but rather that the relationship between these things has to be studied and understood and taken advantage of. And rather than thinking of the network as this continual threat to authority or to thinking or to education or to the sequestered space of the classroom, or the private, necessarily private space of the classroom, or something along those lines. In fact, here, as Derrida says, and I'll get to the quote in a second, we can imagine, or we need to see the virtual as a space that opens up new kinds of relations that we are obligated to deal with. And here's the quote, and this is from Spectres of Marx. The deployment of technoscience or teletechnology obliges us more than ever to think the virtualization of time and space, the possibility of virtual events whose movement and speed prohibit us more than ever from opposing presence to its representation, real time to deferred time, effectivity to its simulacrum. It obliges us to think from there another space for democracy to come, and thus for justice. And that's a little bit of a difficult quote to try and digest just by listening to it. But, in part what we see here is a kind of classical, recognizable Derridian move where we are taking apart binaries like presence and representation, real time and deferred time, even time and space, right, as kind of binaries. And what I see Derrida suggesting to us here is the idea that in the virtual world, particularly as we imagine it now, and we see these sort of networked spaces that overlap with physical spaces, and media and databases that are continually with us and accessible to us at all times, and that we send ourselves out there through the network to communicate and develop relationships that are fully mediated relationships, that it's impossible for us to maintain this distinction, as he puts it, between opposition between presence and representation, and that if we take advantage of it, that there is out there another space for democracy, right? Another way of thinking about, we imagine representation and presence in different ways, and then clearly we have to imagine democracy in different ways. And that's not to suggest at all that the internet is this, amazingly free democratic space, that it doesn't have all the problems that we talk about with accessibility and so forth, and literacy, that the internet doesn't bring with it all the problems that we otherwise have. I mean, people are, don't check their ideologies at the door when they go online, so it's not, obviously it's not some sort of idyllic space. That's not Derrida's point. I don't think it's rather that we have to understand that since the way we understand cognition and subjectivity and space and these things are all inform how we understand democracy, that when we enter this space we have a different kind of democracy, another space of democracy, and that we need to understand it in those terms and investigate it under those terms. And in a more accessible way, I think Reingold is making a similar point, speaking specifically to education now, where he says, education could play a pivotal role by equipping today's digital natives with historical knowledge, personal experience, rhetorical skills, and a theoretical framework for understanding the connection between their power to publish online, their power to influence the circumstances of their own lives, and the health of democracy. And so, I think this is a reassuring way of thinking about it, if you're a humanist, where you can say, all right, well, I can get on board with, ideas like historical knowledge, theoretical framework, rhetorical skills, speaking to the individual experiences of students and having them think critically about those, that those things all make sense, and what Reingold is saying here is that we have to take all of those kind of traditional liberal arts humanistic kinds of educational practices and think about them in the context of what is possible online and possible through networks. How do we bring that kind of knowledge and those values into the space of mobile networks, into the sharing of media online, and what we may do with that power and that ability in terms of changing our own individual lives, changing our lives in a civic or collective sense, and more broadly thinking about democracy. And so, again, perhaps it's a little bit optimistic thinking, which we could probably use some of. But nevertheless, I mean, it is certainly a direction to move in. And it's not, of course, when we think about this, we can't just bring the old ways and just impose them on the new context. We have to understand how all of these things are shifted by the environment into which we are moving. And that brings me kind of to my last real slide here, whereas this is from the end of Clay Shirky's new book. And he says, I'm old enough to know a lot of things just from life experience. I know that newspapers are where you get your political news and how you look for a job. I know that music comes from stores. I know that if you want to have a conversation with someone, you call them on the phone. I know that complicated things like software and encyclopedias have to be created by professionals. In the last 15 years, I've had to unlearn every one of those things and a million others because they have stopped being true. And, so I think in a way that wraps it up, particularly for where many of us are still in humanities, that we grew up with a certain way of understanding how knowledge works and where we find it and who gets to do what and who gets to say what, and what the relationships are between people that are authors and experts and people that are audiences and students and so forth, and that those relationships simply don't exist in the way that they once did. They still exist in some senses, obviously, but in many ways they have changed. And so now we have to unlearn all of the things that we've learned from our experiences and see things in a new light. And so, yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening. And yeah, sure, post any questions you have as comments, and I'll add a little bit about how things went if anyone's interested.